What is some dark shit going on around the world right now that the public probably doesn't know about? Saudi Arabia sentencing to death people who refuse to move out of their homes so that they can build Neom, their new megacity. And their relatives being sentenced to multiple decades of prison time just for protesting or merely posting their support to the cause on social media. Edit, link to video u2.bert9air5xrg. This was the cover feature in Bloomberg Businessweek a couple months back. Pretty interesting. Sounds absolutely insane. I think people have been desensitized to murder in Saudi Arabia. Those duckers will hang you for sneezing in the wrong direction. Western media is really good at keeping Saudi oppression hidden. Oil be surprised about that. I think we need a subreddit or news website dedicated to that kind of non-trending and barely known but actually very important news. Is there something like that out there? Absolutely would join it. The trick is this stuff has a pretty high failure rate. I can remember thinking right at the start of Jan 2020 this virus thing could turn into a big deal, but I also think that probably weekly about something else that ends up being a flash in the pan. So the subreddit would likely be filled with a bunch of barely known news that also ends up being quite unimportant as well. Like virtually everything, it's easy to know what's going to be important in hindsight. Weekly about something else that ends up being a flash in the pan. Remember murder hornets? I was just thinking having those earlier. Whatever happened to them? People realized that the name didn't refer to them being dangerous to humans, they just murder bees, and your average Joe McNewsreader doesn't even like bees, so why does he care if they get murdered by hornets? In Africa there is a very real and very extensive slave trade going on right now, to say nothing of the other probably 40 million living in bondage. I used to work for a multinational company with operations in a country in West Africa. I was on a business trip there once and I noticed there were 3 employees who were excellent, hard workers, did a great job, always polite and friendly. There was a woman who was the opposite. She was surly, lazy and horrible. I asked the manager why they don't just fire her. It turned out she owned the other 3. Every month they had to give their wages to her. If the company fired her, she would leave and take her slaves with her to work somewhere else. I know it's a very real and current thing, but the sentence "she owned the other 3" is completely terrifying and such a weird concept to comprehend. 70% of the world's chocolate comes from West Africa. An estimated 1.5 million child slaves are engaged in chocolate production in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, alone, not counting Nigeria and Cameroon. Mass kidnapping of school children in Nigeria and other African nations, and the only ones talking about it since 2021 is UNICEF. Edit, yikes, first time a comment broke 1K likes. Thanks for the love. For the record, I'm speaking from an American's perspective who spent the better part of a decade serving in Europeasia with the military, and can say for certain the only reason I'm aware of it is because of anti-human trafficking awareness the US Air Force talks about constantly. I work directly with NATO and listening to us AFRICOM talk about it daily, and yet you never hear about it in the mainstream American media. I live in northern Nigeria and kidnappings are so common. It's so common that most people in the north personally know at least one person that has been kidnapped before. They attack trains, military bases, airports, schools, rich people, poor people. They even set up roadblocks and kidnap people for hours, and the government is doing nothing about it. Are they kidnapping them to traffic them? No, the kidnappings are mostly done for ransom. I'm in Mexico right now. Indigenous children are being sold for rape in the state of Guerrero like pieces of meat. Government turns a blind eye and civilians are threatened by the cartel. It's messed up. Welcome to Mexico, and not only Guerrero, we can add Chiapas, Oaxaca, Tabasco, Veracruz, and Estado de Mexico. Unfortunately, the country is some sort of narco state. My old supervisor would joke that he bought me a vacation to Veracruz, as 98% of murders go unreported. Bacterial resistance to antibiotics is at an alarming level. There has already been instances of pan-antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. This can throw us back to the pre-antibiotic era. Which will effectively mean, catch an infection and die. No big pharma wants to invest in antibiotic research because of the huge road cost and relatively meager return. Although everyone agrees that we desperately need new antibiotics. Well, as soon as dying from infections becomes a rich people problem again, the interest will skyrocket. Check out a billionaire named Daryl Katz. Hess currently dying of an antibiotic-resistant sinus infection. And the irony is he made his billions in the pharmacy business. Thanks for posting this so I could learn. How crazy. I started getting sinus, ear infections and a scalp condition about 3 to 4 years ago. Seems like a round of antibiotics helps for a bit sometimes, but then it comes back or doesn't really subside. I went to an ENT BC. I lost my hearing. Turns out it was sinus related. Turned out my sinuses were all out of whack, and I got sinus infections all the time. BC, I basically had a permanent sinus infection. I got the prescribed procedures, maxed my insurance deductible out in January for it, and it's been life-changing. Might not be your case, but I never would have known if I didn't go to the ENT and they did a scan of my nasal after the second procedure failed to restore my hearing permanently. Before that I'd get at least 2 sinus infections every year like clockwork. 5 years ago I got jumped by a group of gang members in a bar. The only injury I had was when one of them head-butted me in the face and broke my nose in 2 places. I needed a small nose lift to get the bones back in place. I used to have really bad sinus problems all the time. Except for a small sinus infection last year that cleared up quickly, I've been perfectly fine since that night. They really did me a solid with that one lamau. That the vast majority of slavery still existing in the world right now is for agricultural purposes. And by slavery, I mean people owned by other people and forced to do work for no pay, as opposed to people doing what they need to do out of necessity and accepting what pittance they receive in return. And the produce is sold on the regular market. Meaning that there is a non-zero chance that you have brought vegetables that were grown by literal slaves. Vegetables? Sure. But the most obvious answer is in the Middle East. Countries like the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, etc. All of that infrastructure was built by foreign labor whose passports are confiscated. They're essentially stuck in those countries with harsh conditions and are treated as slaves unable to go home. Who the hell do you think built the stadiums for the Qatar World Cup starting next month? They didn't just build a stadium. Qatar built a whole ducking city for the World Cup. They've had more than 6,500 migrant workers die there since the project started. Shame on the rulers of Qatar, but also big fucking shame on FIFA for their willful ignorance about the horrible behavior of host nations. FIFA does a lot of shady shit. I think there was some list of disgusting things they've done being passed around Reddit a while back. I did a deep dive a couple of years ago for a podcast. 2018 the number of migrant workers killed in Qatar was 3,000, as you can see that number has continued to rise. This is the second World Cup in a row that's being held in a country with international condemnation for their human rights abuses. Then again, Australia has also been criticized on the global stage for our mistreatment of asylum seekers, but the IOC is happily coming here in 2032. FIFA and the IOC are like 1 and 1A when it comes to corruption in the name of sport diplomacy. Every day a different person asks a slightly reworded question about what men or women want on AskReddit. That's just I learning about us, don't worry about it. Thanks for sharing all this, guys. I don't think I'm living past 50 now. I'm still scrolling and ruining my own day. Fast fashion is a human rights and an environmental disaster. There are certain parts of the garment construction process that cannot be mechanized, so humans have to be involved in the production, and the vast majority of them are underpaid. Additionally, fast fashion, especially in women's clothing, isn't made to last, so the fabric and the actual construction is shoddy and the clothes wear out quickly, but fabric recycling is rarely available, so most of those clothes end up in a landfill. Natural fibers release greenhouse gases, ADA. This is an issue in landfills because organic materials decompose in an anaerobic environment in landfills versus an aerobic composting environment, which creates more methane source as they decompose, and synthetics release chemicals into the water table. I have a degree in costume and we did a lot of work around sustainability because the fashion clothing industry is so harmful. The amount of water used to make fabrics is also very damaging. I love my field of work, but companies need to do better and we need to stop supporting Shine. There's a documentary on All 4 where someone went undercover in a factory for Shine in China. What they uncovered is horrific. I sew for 8 hours a day on a wage just above minimum, and that's mentally draining, so for those ladies working 10+ hours for pennies is disgraceful. Trust me, it's not just Shein either. Half your bougie brands? I've seen them being made in my garage as a kid by my adoptive mother, who was an immigrant scraping by to live her dream of raising a child. Van would show up. They'd barter the price for the job. She'd sew morning to night. Week or two later pickup happens, rinse and repeat. This is 90s Australia BTW. And still occurring.